and now I will respond to the arguments raised by the opposing party in the suggested order. Therefore, it is the respondent's submission that the claimant is not entitled to seek contract adaptation firstly under the hardship clause, as the tariffs did not fall under the scope of hardship in clause number 12, and also the contract does not provide for a remedy such as contract adaptation. And secondly, the claimant is also not entitled to seek contract adaptation under the contract law, that is first and foremost the CISG, only in the second instance gap-filled by the provisions of the UNIDROIT principles. Members of the tribunal, in these proceedings, the issue that we are facing is the issue of contract adaptation, which under present circumstances require two key elements. First, the consent of the parties to such a remedy, and secondly, the event that causes hardship, neither of which are present in the foregoing case. And therefore, moving on to the first issue, it is the respondent's position that the imposed tariffs, contrary to the statement made by the opposing counsel, did not amount to hardship under clause number 12. The starting point of the contention between the parties is the wording of the hardship clause, which is already known to this tribunal. However, I kindly ask to follow page 14 again. On page 14, we can read under clause number 12, seller shall not be responsible for, and the second last line, hardship caused by additional health and safety requirements or comparable unforeseen events, making the contract more onerous. Therefore, there are three requirements. The tariffs would need to be comparable, unforeseen, and lastly, and most importantly, they would need to make the performance of the contract more onerous. And as a preliminary remark, I must underline that all three requirements need to be met in order for hardship to be present. When it comes to the adjective comparable, we must take into consideration the intent the parties had whilst drafting this clause in establishing whether the imposed tariffs due to retaliatory reasons actually were comparable to health and safety regulations. In the respondent's view, they were not. The only reason as to why the parties decided on inclusion of the hardship clause was the past unpleasant experience of the claimant that was explained to this tribunal by the opposing party. In these other proceedings, the claimant was burdened with a 40% of the price increase due to the health and safety requirements, and to these events it wanted to include a hardship clause. Tariffs were not comparable to health and safety regulations as they serve different purposes. Health and safety regulations are to prevent transmission of diseases, and the tariffs, when were introduced due to political reasons, they cannot be deemed as comparable. It is also confirmed by the fact that the respondent, our client, rejected initially proposed ICC hardship clause by the claimant as it considered it to be too broad. It wanted a narrowly, expressly enumerating hardship clause, the types of events that would constitute hardship between the parties.
How does the fact that a party rejected one type of clause, how do you say it should influence our interpretation of the clause that they have agreed?
Mr. Arbitrator, that is the party's intention that they wanted a narrowly enumerated types of events that would constitute hardship. It is also confirmed by the fact that the claimant accepted a DDP type of delivery, and it is correct that the parties may modify the aspects of such an Incoterm. This is what the parties did under clauses on page 14, in clause number 10 and in clause number 13, that is the tank rental fees and insurance, which would normally lie with the seller. That was the buyer, that is the respondent, who was bearing these types of fees. However, there is nothing included in the provisions of the contract with regard to customs regulations. And under DDP type of delivery, customs and tariffs lie with the seller, that is the claimant. And in order to exclude them, they would need to be expressly excluded, as in accordance, for example, to Professor Gabriel, who stated that certain obligations may be derogated from Incoterms, however, they need to be explicitly derogated in the contract. There is no derogation here.
But do you say that it would be impossible to have a hardship clause and an adaptation in a DDP contract, or is it just a question of facts?
No, in general that would be possible. However, in the present case, with regard to the provisions of the contract, the customs and tariffs did not fall under the hardship clause, and therefore they still remained within the sphere of the obligations of the seller.
Your point on that.
And
what's your response to claimants' contention that they only agreed to DDP on the condition of an increase in price and the risk that they wouldn't accept the risk of customs tariffs increases?
Mr. Arbitrator, that is another fact that is in favor of our client, and in order to prove that, I kindly ask to follow 3 pages simultaneously, and that is page number 10.
That's because you can't able to do.
My apologies, however, it is necessary as the facts are distributed in the case file.
Yeah, we'll do them shortly after one another, yeah.
Of course.
Yep.
So first, page number 10, and that is second to last paragraph. It states the basic conditions would be as followed: price $99,500. Then let's turn to page 56 of the report. Under question number 8 on page 56, we can see in the last line, additional costs associated with transportation and DDP delivery per dose are $200. Therefore, logically speaking, the final price should be $99,700. But when we look at page number 13 of the record, and that is the contract, the price for 1 dose in the third paragraph, it states that the seller agrees to provide the buyer with 100 doses. And then in the third line, the price is in exchange for a non-refundable fee of $100,000. The price increased by $300 on the shipment despite the direct cost of delivery. In terms of 100 doses, that is $30,000 of price increase above direct cost of delivery. That is the indication of assumption of risk on the claimant's part. And as to the requirement of unforeseeability, it is the respondent's position that the tariffs were indeed foreseeable. They were a result of political chain of actions, and the president in Mediterranean meal expressed that it would take a more protectionist approach prior to the contract conclusion. Equatoriana established a pattern of retaliatory behavior as it retaliated in the past once against comparable tariffs.
Sorry, how's doing it once, how's that pattern?
Hypothetically, the parties could have taken under consideration that such a scenario could be repeated in the future. And also, what is even more important, the article was published on 20th of December, that is on page 15 of the record. It was published on 20th of December, and both of the parties read the article. The tariffs took effect from 15th of January. The claimant had a whole month to inquire whether the frozen semen would lie under the agricultural products. However, it did that only a few days before the shipment. Hypothetically, if the claimant inquired whether the frozen semen lied within that notion, the parties could have moved the term of last shipment and avoid the imposition of tariffs. And the last requirement, that is to make the performance of the contract more onerous, it was stated by the opposing counsel that the tariffs amount to 30% of the price increase, and that statement is correct, if not one crucial factor. It only affected the last shipment, that is 50 doses. When we take into consideration the whole contract, the price increased by 15%. 15% is not enough to constitute hardship and to make the contract more onerous, as it is within the business risk of the entrepreneur, that is the normal business risk, and if the alteration of the price does not amount to hardship. It was found by numerous scholars, for example, Professor Brunner, or such authorities as Professor Spencer and Professor Schlechtring, that the alteration of at least 50, if not 100 or 200% is enough to constitute hardship, therefore a couple of times less in the case at hand. Also, in one of the cases, in the ICC case number 8486, it was found by the court that a party cannot invoke hardship in performance simply because the contract turns out to be unprofitable. That is within the business risk.
Was that a CISG case or not?
That was based on the UNIDROIT principles, which in the case
Right.
at hand are also the contract law. And as to the remedy under the hardship clause that was not mentioned by the opposing counsel, when we take into consideration Article 12, that is the hardship clause, it merely states, a seller shall not be responsible for. Not be responsible for means that the parties agreed on a remedy as exemption from liability and not contract adaptation. It is confirmed by the fact that the parties added the part with regard to hardship clause into the force majeure clause, intending for one remedy to be available in cases of both force majeure and hardship. And moving on to the second submission, that is that the claimant should be stopped from seeking contract adaptation under the contract law, it must be emphasized that the CISG is the law applicable first and foremost, as the CISG constitutes the overriding provisions which take a priority over any other laws. And therefore, we need to first take into consideration Article 79 of the CISG. Article 79 of the CISG refers to the notion of impediment beyond the party's control. During the drafting history of the CISG, the drafters have considered the possibility of inclusion of the hardship clause into the provisions of the convention. However, at the end of the day, hardship was left out of Article 79 CISG. It was found in a couple of cases that Article 79 does not govern hardship. For example, in the Aramcron case, where the CISG was still applicable, it was also confirmed in the sunflower seeds case heard by the appellate court in Greece. It was found that hardship does not prevent the party from its performance, and only impossibility, that is, prevents the party from performing the contract. Also, for example, Professor Lukowski stated that seeking contract adaptation as a remedy which does not exist in any of the provisions of the CISG is at least one step too far. Moreover, if the tribunal finds that in some cases hardship can be extended to Article 79 of the CISG, the parties derogated from statutory provisions by including hardship clause into the contract. Hardship clause and also force majeure clauses in general in business transactions are the most common way to derogate from the provisions regarding risk, payment, and allocation of risk based on the CISG. By inclusion of the hardship clause, the parties derogated from general provisions of contract law. And also another factor that supports the respondent's position in this regard is the fact that the parties have agreed on a DDP type of delivery, that is the Incoterm. It was found also, for example, in the Advisory Council's opinion number 17, which concerns the exclusions of CISG, that inclusion of an Incoterm usually derogates Article 79 of the CISG with regard to risk undertaken by the parties. In the case at hand, we have both the hardship clause and the DDP type of delivery. Therefore, we cannot resort to provisions of a contract law, and we must take into consideration first and foremost the provisions in the contract. However, for the sake of argument, if this tribunal was to apply the UNIDROIT principles as suggested by the opposing party, it is the respondent's submission that there was no hardship under the provisions of the UNIDROIT, which in fact impose even a higher threshold of hardship, as they demand excessive alteration, fundamental alteration of the equilibrium of the contract. 15% is not enough to fulfill this requirement.
But excessive is a value judgment, isn't it?
That is correct, Mr. Arp.
It's not a question of percentages, is it? How do you say excessive? What would be excessive in this case?
Mr. Arbitrator, it was found in the commentary to the UNIDROIT principles that the alteration of at least 50% is demanded to constitute hardship, and it is even questionable. It was found in the commentary that at least 100 or 200% are enough to constitute hardship. And
is it not necessary to take into account the margin that the claimant would have made in the contract? So if you lose 15% and your margin is 5%, it might be seen as much more excessively onerous than say if you had a much larger margin.
Mr. Arbitrator, to answer that question, the profit is not taken into account of hardship, as we generally take into consideration the price increase and not the lost profit. or a loss generally on performance of the contract. It was the claimant who established the final prices it demanded, $100 per one dose. Therefore, it was within its sphere of discretion to demand as much profit as it wanted from the respondent, and as it only established a 5% of profit, the respondent should not be held liable for how the parties decided to structure the contract.
Right, well, I think we're out of time, so we'll move on. Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Shizuka,
Okay, thank you.
you have a minute.
Yes, and I would like to submit about the purchase price. And because claimant increased the purchase price $1,000 because the cost of shipment is increased by accepting DDP. Because usually the input term of claimant is EXW. Therefore, to accept DDP, the cost of shipment is to be increased. Therefore, the claimant asked the price increase. Therefore, clause 12 is made to remove any further risk associated to the custom regulations. Therefore, in this case, the clause 12 is the tariff imposition is within the scope of the clause 12. And I'd like to shortly explain why claimant performed its obligation to shipment. According to the witness statement, respondent urged to authorize the shipment as planned and emphasized their interest in a long-term relationship with claimant. He was certain that a solution would be found through negotiation and told claimant about respondent's plans to buy 50 uses from another stallion. Therefore, claimant believed that the relationship would be continued in the future, and claimant believed that the price would be renegotiated. Therefore, claimant should.
These are not really reply points, are they? These are repeats of points you've made. Are these replying submissions?
Yes.
They are. I think we're out of time, as it happens, so I've got those points. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Ziegler. Yes, your reply. 1 minute.
That is indeed correct that the claimant has increased the price. However, it increased the price by almost 2 times more than direct cost of delivery. Therefore, it constitutes the assumption of risk. And as to the second argument raised by the opposing counsel, the claimant has shipped the frozen semen in order to perform its obligations under the contract. The respondent did not urge or push the claimant to perform its obligations, and it did not promise.
But it requested, didn't it?
That is, it requested to perform the obligations under the contract, since the contract does not provide for contract adaptation, the claimant cannot seek the remedies the parties did not agree upon.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. Good. Well, thank you.